Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, How Thoughtful UX Can Benefit Both Users and Advertisers. Thanks for joining us. I'm Samantha from Digiday, and I'll be your moderator. Today's webinar is sponsored by Instart. Instart thinks every day about how they can help you leverage artificial intelligence to increase conversion, transform consumer experience, improve your SEO rankings, keep your customers safe, and deliver 10% to 30% faster cloud, web, and mobile application performance. A question and answer period will follow the presentation, so please stay with us until the end. Feel free to submit questions at any time via the GoToWebinar panel. Everyone who registered for today's webinar will also receive an email with a recording of the session tomorrow, so stay tuned for that. We're joined today by Brian Murphy, Head of Product and Media at Instart, and Scott Mulqueen, VP of Programmatic and Data Strategy and Operations at Trusted Media Brands. Brian is the head of media products at Instart, where he oversees the development of Instart's complete line of digital experience products for publishers and media companies, including Instart's industry-leading ad recovery solution and ad acceleration solutions. Brian has a wealth of experience in the media and publishing industry. Prior to Instart, he was VP of Product Management at Integral Ad Science, responsible for solutions including brand safety and fraud detection. Brian began his media career on the agency side at Goodby, Silverstein & Partners, working on brands such as General Motors and Netflix, and has also worked as a marketer at esurance.com. Scott Mulqueen currently oversees the programmatic and data businesses at Trusted Media Brands. In this role, he manages strategy, technology, and monetization of all forms of machine-driven advertising across the TMB properties. Mulqueen's industry background includes a year commanding the programmatic strategy at Time Inc., nearly 4 years at About.com, where he cultivated the programmatic business from the ground up, and a 2-year tenure with Hearst Digital, running yield revenue management for the magazine's division. Okay, let's get started. Brian, take it away.
Great, thank you, and hi everybody. Thanks for joining today. As was mentioned, we're going to spend the day, this session, speaking about the kind of relationship between user experience and advertising, media, and kind of all the dynamics of that. So I'm excited to have Scott joining because he brings an interesting publisher perspective, and of course, we'll share some other kind of anecdotes from our experience as well. Overall, we're going to talk a bit about just the general trends we see in this space and in that topic in particular, and then from there, we'll talk about some specific subject areas like what you can do to modify to improve user experience and ad experience at the same time from both a business perspective and a technology perspective. And then at the end, we'll, of course, be happy to take questions and talk more about this. So the first thing we wanted to do is just call out that this is actually this kind of tension between user experience and a great site experience and advertising is one that's existed for a long time. And you can see that in the data. So on the left, we have a chart that shows what publishers are thinking about. And so you can see subscriptions are very top of mind. We hear that a lot in the industry right now. Other forms of revenue for media. But then you can see on the right that we know that display and other advertising, digital advertising mechanisms are still really important from a revenue standpoint. And so I think it probably comes as no surprise to anybody on this call that there's this constant discussion about the balance of those two things, how you create new revenue streams, but also protect existing ones. And that's one of the things that we find our media customers are always engaged in, and one of the conversations we spend a lot of time talking with them about. And Digiday can actually back this up too, because they had this interesting stat that 58% of Digiday members think media is experiencing a user experience crisis. And I think for those of us that spend a lot of time looking at media pages and sites, it's not a huge surprise. We know that there are increasing numbers of tags on the site and lots of different things going on, and that creates all sorts of resource conflicts in terms of loading content and priority conflicts in terms of how you treat, say, advertising versus other types of content or even third-party content. And so the net effect of this is that you have many competing aspects of any given site experience or user experience, and those elements have to kind of mix and match in the right way. And so for a user, that can be very disjointed and be very problematic. And so the way we really think about this is this kind of comes back to this discussion of what does it take to have a happy visitor to your site, and then how do you maximize your revenue? And we think about it in terms of advertising, how do you maximize your CPMs? And what we'll discuss today is that there are a number of different ways to approach that problem. Some technical, some from a sort of general optimization standpoint, and then some are philosophical, and that's Scott and I will talk a bit about that too. So Scott, as we wait for the slide to shift here, maybe we can just start with that general conversation. Oh, looks like we have a PowerPoint situation. But Scott, yeah, maybe we can just start with a general conversation about this relationship between creating a positive user experience for your site visitor and then the need to monetize that experience as well.
Yeah, definitely. It's certainly become a lot more interesting now versus the last few years. We've kind of matured in the obvious direction. And I think in a lot of situations, publishers were not necessarily prepared for this maturation process and this reality. The ideal situation really would be for publishers to create high quality content with fast loading, high quality content where users can find easily that content that they're interested in and engage with it appropriately, and along with that appropriate ad alignment and relevancy. So, and all of that rendering in the speediest fashion possible so as to not create any lag or distortion for the user as they just attempt to read something. It sounds really simple. It's definitely, as you mentioned, Ryan, a seriously fine balance, and one it continues to be a challenge, right? For it seems like most publishers at this point, there are very, very few that have struck that balance appropriately and gotten it right.
Yeah, and I put this slide up because I think one of the challenges is that the industry has changed in terms of the technology that plays a part in the measurement of success. And so, we know things like viewability and programmatic have introduced new technologies to the stack, and I think they complicate the overall sort of layers of technology that have to interact with each other in order to create a great user experience. And so I'm curious, maybe we can just touch on viewability. How do you think that's changed the sort of the nature of site design, as that standards come into the market?
Sites definitely look much different in layout and function as a result of publishers chasing the viewability demands that advertisers have over the last couple of years put on them. It's really no longer a case where volume wins, because that doesn't necessarily denote positive performance for an advertiser. So as publishers improve the quality and overall health of their ad supply, that definitely diminishes the places in which the ads could potentially render. So for best places to invest real estate to put those, generally publishers will focus on top of page, in line with natural stopping points for readers, and ultimately for any medium to longer form content, render ads through lazy loading. But as you consider how much space is actually available across the different screen types and platforms for consumption, it definitely becomes a challenge, right? Because we may in the office have massive monitors and view the internet through a completely different lens than kind of a natural user would through small laptops or phones or small tablets, which constricts the amount of real estate to not only place an ad appropriately, but show the content in a way that makes it easy to consume.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think wanted to actually touch on so I think it's interesting because we know that optimization is happening and that there are those changes being made. And one of the questions that our publishers often ask us is, what's a bad experience? Sort of how many ads are too many ads? What kind of latency is acceptable? And one of the things, because we work, one of the products we have is ad recovery, which is dealing with ad blockers. It's actually very interesting because we see that it tends to be that over aggressive approach when it comes to advertising that drives adoption of ad blockers. And so while sort of premium publishers tend to have a real sensitivity to this user experience and wanting to find that balance, not all sites do. And so when we see that really aggressive behavior, so maybe the next level beyond what you've just talked about, that's where we really start to see users adopting ad blockers and looking for active measures to kind of protect against that site. And so, it was an interesting first insight for us as we started to think about this relationship, because there's definitely kind of a side of things where there can be too many ads or too much optimization. The other sort of version of this that's kind of interesting to think about is when this experience becomes too ad light. We see that sometimes actually in the ad recovery space as well. So once a publisher is doing ad recovery, sometimes they want to just put maybe one advertisement on the page because they know a user is sensitive to that. And what we find there is actually that you can almost go too light with advertising, such that the user experience measure is pretty much the same as if there were full ads, and so you're just not maximizing your opportunity in terms of revenue. So Scott, I'm curious, have you ever, have you bumped into that where you find, that there's a real lean toward UX, kind of at the expense of advertising or revenue?
Yeah, I at this point, after so many years, I've kind of seen all forms of kind of overextension on the ad side, and also under monetization to the detriment of revenue. So I think there again, you need to understand how you're presenting the content, and what does your page layout look like? What are the varieties of templates that you're using that allow for content to be laid out appropriately with ads? And in certain cases, you may be able to take advantage of space on the page where there may be an opportunity to place a little bit more supply in certain areas versus other areas, and there may just not be that opportunity. Another consideration there too is that there are certain content areas, right, that are not in very high advertising demand. So it makes it that much more of a challenge to monetize. There may be a consideration for those areas to go a little bit lighter with supply, because each incremental ad is not worth as much as the one that sits above it, to compounded degrees because of the lack of demand. So there are definitely a number of different signals to take into consideration when deciding how to apply monetization to different template and content combinations.
Interesting. That's a really good point. What I think that leads kind of to our next discussion, which is that there's really, at a very base level, there's sort of this this natural evaluation that needs to be done around the overall experience a user is having on your site and how ad units and editorial are mixing together. And so that's a good point where you can create maybe a more positive user experience in places where there isn't as much advertising demand, and then balance that in the high demand areas. So the other thing we wanted to talk about is, we'll get a little bit more into some of the specific ways that we see this playing out. And the question we sort of wanted to answer was, do all visitors expect the same experience? And one really interesting insight that we've had as we work with different publishers and sort of address their different UX and digital experience needs is that traffic coming from different sources can actually expect a different experience. So this came up in a session we did with some of our other customers, and the comment was that traffic from something like Outbrain, because of the nature of that click and where the user's coming from, may be more tolerant of a heavier ad experience or a more robust ad experience than organic traffic where it may be coming from somewhere else. So Scott, I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I have not necessarily focused ever on traffic from an outlet like an Outbrain or a Taboola, but if you think about the use case of basically any website, right? So I've existed in search-heavy publishers and not so search-heavy, and with a lot of direct traffic, and those different scenarios of interaction with the sites yield completely different tolerances for page behavior and overall supply configuration. So for example, the appetite for a user coming in through search who is looking for some specific bit of information or knowledge or needs to learn something or whatever is very specific, and they want to be able to get to the page fast. So hopefully your page renders really quickly because they probably came in from search, or they definitely came in from search from Google, and Google has 300 million other items that they could click on underneath your ranking. So make sure that you can render your page very fast. For the search users, make sure that you render the content appropriately and likely first before anything else, so that they can find what they're looking for. And as that user kind of begins to engage with your content, then begin to render the ad experience. Because it's likely that, given what they're doing and the utilitarian nature of search, they're not necessarily with the most discretionary time at their hands, as opposed to someone that may be coming in from social or an Outbrain that has time on their hands and has the ability or the luxury to wait for a slow page load or a slow content load and sift through a jumbled page in order to surface the content. So I think it's really dependent on the intent of the user and how they approach the need of using the website.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's something we see our publishers doing a lot is testing and optimizing against all those different types of metrics and sort of cuts. And so traffic sources is certainly one, different templates and layouts for different types of users is one, ad formats too. And so that's certainly a best practice, and one that I think we're seeing more and more of is this understanding that site traffic is actually quite granular, and there can be a lot of different variations of the right user experience for different types of users.
Yes, definitely.
And so then we want to talk about the relationship between ad tech and user experience, and this is actually where Instart spends a lot of its time as a company. So we've had a fair amount of experience here, and it's interesting because, as I mentioned before, there's an increasing amount of technology on the page that's related to advertising, targeting in some way or another, and as these new technologies get introduced, they make optimizing more difficult. And I think there's a tendency actually to optimize against things like CPM, but to sort of lose sight of the user experience in that process. So there's all sorts of reasons for this. We talk about ad stack complexity, things like header bidding, and then of course sort of challenges like fraud that kind of further muddy the waters in terms of performance. And Scott mentioned earlier, the way we're seeing that dealt with today is that there can be, there are protections you can put in place and sort of techniques you can use, like lazy loading, where you're helping kind of increase the speed of content delivery and only rendering ads when you know they're going to be needed, or header bidding management, where where before maybe you had many different header bidding partners because you were looking for maximum CPM. Now we're seeing refinement there where there's attention back to kind of related to that. And overall, I think there's an increasing, kind of back to Digiday's stat on the sense of a crisis in UX. I think there's an increasing awareness that all this technology is driving latency, and that has a negative effect on users. So Scott, I'm curious if you have any comments on that before I throw some more statistics up on the screen.
Yeah, I mean, latency is effectively like the death blow to an internet user. Because they're the user, and that visit is your primary source of inventory, right? Before ad supply actually happens or page views, and that's your starting point then to begin monetization considerations. So from that starting point, understanding how your page is firing, how it's rendering, what lines of code are firing off first to generate the varying pieces or the varying elements of the page is super important, and making sure that the primary reason for the users coming to your site, the information and the content, is getting to their eyeballs as quickly as possible. The sooner that happens, the better opportunity the publisher has to reduce their bounce rate, keep the eyeballs on their pages within the session, and then begin to consider the ad rendering process. But yeah, the chase down for dollars over the last couple of years with a lot of publishers adding tons of client-side header bidding partners, and the complexities of pixels firing on pages, and as creatives become more complex and fire varying ad calls to verification systems, all of that stuff just kind of slows down and bogs down already heavily weighted down web pages and makes them slower. So knowing what you're doing from a technology perspective and knowing what types of creatives are entering your ecosystem are huge signals to understand and to optimize against in order to push back against those negative challenges and force the content to load as fast as you possibly can in order to maintain that user. Like I mentioned before, it's highly likely that user has another option to ingest the same content on another publisher's property.
Yeah, but I think that's a really good point. And let me see if I can get to the next slide here. We may lose this PowerPoint again, but the statistic I referenced earlier that I think is relevant to this is that 83% of visitors notice when a website has ads that load slower than content. So while certainly content is the primary user experience that they're focused on, the delivery of ads delayed behind that content is actually something that users notice as well. And that was actually, we found as we started to look into this that there weren't many statistics around this. So we, as part of our 2018 reader expectations study, that was one of the questions we asked. And so I think that's, what we're starting to find is that the right user experience and the best user experience is one where all of the content, including the ads, loads as close to the same time as possible. It's the least disruptive. You don't have things moving around on the page as ads fill in later. And so really one of the big challenges with that is that so much of that activity is third party. And that's where, working with our publishers, we've started to sort of say, well, what can we do from the publisher's point of view? So I thought I would just show quickly. Oh, maybe not. Sorry about these, the presentation challenges here. Well, so I'll just talk about it. So one of the things we've started to do is look at how we can rearrange and accelerate specific ad-related calls without disrupting content. And the effect has been pretty intriguing. So it turns out, and we mentioned this earlier, that there are so many complexities in terms of the different aspects of the page and the different technology on the page that and I think we're going to pull this slide up in a second, that it's difficult to manually optimize that. So just as an example, we put this up just to kind of show what the effect that we're talking about. So you can see on the left is sort of a traditional waterfall. So if you look at a site waterfall, that's the nature of the calls, and there's a lot of sort of idle time at the beginning while the HTML or the HTTP call is made and the initial request is made. And what we started to think about doing, what we can actually do, is finding those important ad calls and firing them in parallel with that initial request. And the thing that does is it sets the stage. And so without disrupting the flow of content back to the page, you're firing off those calls quicker and getting, priming all those ad aspects so that they can load faster when the page is ready. And the effect, let's see here. The effect has been really quite compelling in the sense that this is, I just put this up, this is a test we did over the summer with a mobile site, and you can see that orange line is actually the increase in viewability from technical optimization through Instart. So not relaying out anything, not making any of those other optimizations we talked about, just actually using technology to make smarter decisions about how critical ad calls are fired off, and using idle time in the browser to do that, you can actually drive up viewability. And so that's the key thing there, is both it drives revenue, but also from a user experience standpoint, you're pulling ads closer to the same time as content. And we know that that's really important overall. So just thought that was kind of an interesting, interesting representation of this technology angle to dealing with the problem.
Brian, the other interesting thing here from an overall monetization perspective is that if the sooner the ads render, the better up and are in the viewport, the better opportunity they are to be engaged with and clicked on. And ultimately, especially within programmatic land with machine algorithms just firing off all the time and learning every second of every day about your inventory, that better performance ultimately leads to more advertiser investment, or the machine's pointing to the advertiser investment to your supply. So any, to hammer home your point, any opportunity to get those ads to render faster and be in the face of the user, the better off your overall yield will be.
Yeah, and I think you make an important point there, which is that, we've sort of talked about user experience from the point of view of a user and a media publisher. The advertiser actually cares about user experience as well. They want, in general, especially premium advertisers, want their ads to be rendering in an environment that's a positive experience for the user, because it's, there's an association there that's important. So overall, the nice thing about this topic is that you end up with kind of all sides of the equation wanting the same thing. And it's just, it's just a matter of kind of putting all these different tool sets together to achieve it. So I think that's pretty much all we have in terms of content. Thanks for bearing with us with the presentation issues. We thought now we'd open it up a bit to Q&A, and happy to take questions from the audience, and Scott and I, of course, can chat a bit more about this as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian and Scott, for all of your great insights. So just a reminder for all of our attendees, the full recording of the webinar will be made available to you in a follow-up email tomorrow. So we're now going to move on to the question and answer portion of the webinar. And you can submit questions at any time via the GoToWebinar panel. All right, so let's start off with this question here. And it asks, do you find that users with ad block software become frustrated when they see ads?
That's an interesting question, actually. We probably could have put a slide up on that. So speaking of user experience in that environment, I guess I touched on this a bit. It's been really interesting as we've rolled out the ad recovery product and worked with different publishers on that. They were initially, the best practice was sort of, well, let's do an ad light experience to start and make sure, because we're sensitive to these users being sensitive to ads, that we don't over can bombard them with advertising. And what we found is that they're actually very tolerant when we're dealing with top-tier publishers, because top-tier publishers think a lot about this relationship between ads and content already. So at this point, we're pretty well distributed across a lot of major publishers for ad recovery, and almost all of them have gone back to a full ad experience because they can't find any indication that users have a problem with that. And so we think that really speaks to the difference between premium quality content and then sort of long tail content where ads are all over the screen and jumping out at the user. That's the kind of stuff that users are actually using ad blockers for.
Yeah, the experience that I've had is relatively similar. I think in a lot of those cases, ad blockers were installed as a result of horrific experiences, attempting the user attempting to engage with whatever content or whatever site they were on, and a majority of the mindful mid and top tier publishers, are thoughtful of overall user experience and want the users to be able to engage with their content and stay within their ecosystems for as long as possible. So once I believe that experience is actually seen by the user, they're not as apt to not show up again, right? It's not necessarily a deterrent. They were just trying to defend themselves and their poor overloaded browsers from overloaded ad experiences in not so good acting sites. There are definitely a handful that just hate ads and never want to see an ad again, but that's probably a small minority compared to the ones that just bumped into kind of one bad apple in the apple cart, or upsetting the apple cart.
Great. So our next question asks, how should we be thinking about managing third-party services and calls?
That's an interesting question with a lot of complexity behind it. So Scott, I don't know, do you have thoughts on that? And then I can Instart deals with this a lot, so I have a few ideas.
So in my current role at Trusted, we've definitely made a lot of changes since I arrived in June. There are for sure many more changes to go from an optimization standpoint for the sites in general. One of those is understanding who's doing what on the pages at any given time, and understanding who's a bad actor, who is, what is a pixel firing that you want, what you want there, and making sure that you rid your environment of the things that are slow to load, poor technologies, have no real means to create value for the overall user experience. So we are code freeze right now, performing a full assessment of third-party technologies and their impacts to all of our pages, to understand who needs to go, who needs to stay, and attempt, again, to Brian's point earlier in the session, to strike that appropriate balance between speed, content, ads, and overall technology. Because you don't want to strip off too much and not be able to generate revenue, but again, you don't want so many things firing on the pages such that it impedes the overall experience for the user.
Yeah, one of the things we actually run into quite a bit is that it seems to be that a lot of third-party tags end up sort of in a legacy mode where they may have been put on there by some previous regime at a publisher, or may have been there for a good reason at some point and then sort of neutralized over time by other technology, and those don't necessarily get removed. And so one of the things we see our customers doing is actually exactly what Scott just described, which is some kind of an inventory just to get a better understanding of what's going on and where there are actual problems. And then the natural next step of that, because of course sites are always evolving, is, hey, is there an automated way to actually handle that? So today we do that on the e-commerce side, and it may be an interesting application for media that we'll look at down the road.
All right, Scott, this next question is for you. So what changes have you seen most positively impact user experience?
So understanding where, in no specific order, understanding how your users are entering your sites, right? Is it through, again, to my point earlier, is it through social? Is it through an outbrain taboola or content syndication situation? Is it through search? And understanding kind of the intent of the user and their tolerance for a slower experience, a faster experience, a heavier ad experience, or whatever, and then tailoring the site behaviors and the ad behaviors to the user's tolerances. I think that kind of hammers home the fact that the publishers do appreciate the users entering their environments and consuming their content, and want to make sure that the user gets what they want. Because an unfortunate site experience today could potentially mean that when a publisher's content surfaces high in search rankings or is clickable through Facebook content marketing or whatever, that the prior experience doesn't become a deterrent for future behaviors. I think that's kind of a primary thought around how best to make sure that the user is enjoying their experience on your sites.
So are there any mobile-specific user experience considerations that people should take into account?
Speed. It's challenging to deal with slow carrier connections when a user is not on a Wi-Fi connection, and it's hard enough to just fully render a page, let alone think about, okay, how do I balance content and ads there? So anything that a publisher can do to strip down the heaviness of a mobile page, generally from just a sheer UX standpoint, the better off that the publisher is in order to try to get the page to render so the user can actually see the content. That's, at all of the publishers that I've worked at, the mobile has always been a challenge as a result of having to rely on, again, third-party technologies, which in this case would be the carrier connections. That easily see bottlenecks and their servers slow down and just have poor service in certain areas. But unfortunately, the publisher is at the mercy of those situations and has to battle against making sure that the elements that they can load and whatever they can do to make the page as fast as possible within those slow situations does actually work.
So someone asks if either of you can comment on the impact of ad quality vendors in the UX versus ad experience ecosystem.
Interesting. Well, as was previously mentioned, I used to work at Integral Ad Science. So I'd say one thing I know for sure is that they have sensitivity to this as well, and understand that the increased need to verify and measure, does add some overhead. So I think that there's a concerted effort on that side to make sure that those are as lightweight as possible. One of the things we're thinking about as we look at, start to dissect pages and think about speed is that often what you run into is that there are a number of different organizations all trying to capture the same types of information. And I think that that's one of the sort of sticking points right now when you think about latency, is that it can be very difficult to kind of gather information from an ad creative unit, and so it takes a lot of work to kind of break out of that. And there may be ways that we can actually communicate important pieces of information to those measurement companies without them all sort of taking the source to do that themselves. And so, Scott, I don't know if you have thoughts on that. I think that's definitely an open question for the industry.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's definitely a challenge when you have multiple vendors attempting to do the same thing, and ultimately those attempts, definitely create issues from a speed perspective, but also on the back end up with potentially completely different results when they're attempting to measure the same thing. So I think that's probably a conversation for a completely other different webinar, and not this one, but it's definitely another challenge of the overall ecosystem.
Yeah, and a good point, for sure.
Great. And then I think our last question for now is for Brian. So if you can provide any more insight on what caused the viewability lift in the graph you shared?
Let me see. Can I go back to that? Let's see. Yeah, that's a good question. So this was, in this case, this was all about as I mentioned kind of earlier, the activation of critical ad units earlier in the kind of cycle of the page load. And so what we were doing is using technology to identify when there was idle time and then getting those calls initiated earlier. So the interesting effect is that actually there are multiple things that matter there. And I don't know if that was true for this specific study, but in general, we find that you both can speed up the overall performance of the page, which gets you to the kind of display call faster. And you can also accelerate the initiation of the ad call. So the combination of those two things is what drives results like this. You're kind of getting the page to be faster and getting the ad to come in even faster than that. So the overall effect is it's very positive in terms of the user experience, but also looks really nice in terms of the data, because you see site loads improving and you also see viewability going up, which of course is what everybody wants.
Great. Thanks so much for all of that. I just want to ask Brian and Scott if you have any other final insights that you'd like to share before we wrap up.
No, I think it's been a good discussion, and obviously there are a number of angles on this topic. So, we expect this to be a conversation in the industry as we go into the next year, and are always happy to kind of chat about this with anybody interested.
Yeah, ditto on that for sure.
Great. Thanks again to Brian and Scott, and of course our partner Instart. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. We really hope you learned something. So keep an eye on your inboxes tomorrow for a link to the recording, which you can watch on demand. Thanks again, and please enjoy the rest of your day.